Yeah, I think so. Yep. Cool. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming out. This is the Austin React and React Native Meetup. First of all, sorry the pizza's not here yet. We ordered it, and there was a confusion about being picked up versus delivered, so it'll be here in a couple minutes, and we will eat pizza then. Yeah. Sorry about that. There will be a good break in between presenters, and I'll get stuff then. Cool, so thanks everybody for coming out. This is our second meetup. The first one was more social. This one's a bit more technical, so we're excited to see how many people are already coming out. After the event, feel free to let me know if you have any feedback or ideas for future meetups. We're looking for additional presenters or additional topics or whatever else, so we're looking for feedback. First, I wanted to thank Bazaar Voice for hosting us in their new office. And for the drinks as well. That's from those guys, so make sure you thank anyone in a Bazaar Voice hoodie or t-shirt. So the first guy who's going to speak tonight is Dan. Dan is a software engineer turned engineering manager at Bazaar Voice. He works here, currently working to lead improvement to the years-old display at Bazaar Voice using newer technologies like ES6 with Babel, React, Webpacks, and other sanity-improving solutions. He also enjoys bourbon, so that's a little bit about Dan. So here's Dan to tell you a little bit about Bazaar Voice and what they're doing here.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Yeah, so we got this great new space, so we thought let's start having people in it and letting them pay the bill. So that's cool. So yeah, we build ratings and reviews here. If you're not sure what Bazaar Voice does, and so we build that across a bunch of different client sites. A lot of that's third-party JavaScript. If you've ever had to do that, you know the kind of woes that go into building those kind of applications. But we do a lot of other interesting stuff that isn't just front-end display, as you can imagine, having 50 billion reviews sitting around. So on the display side, we have a legacy stack that's a few years old. It's just mangled backbone and a lot of other cool stuff that you don't want to know about. But on the newer end, we're starting a kind of a new approach of that, building smaller applications that work seamlessly, using React, using a lot of the newer hotness that's around that makes our life a lot better. As you can imagine, dependency management being a sane thing now on the front end. Hopefully you're participating in using sane dependency management with things like Webpack. Makes our life a lot easier. So we have a great opportunity to do a lot of cool stuff here with regards to building different kind of display applications around all the consumer content we have. So if that's of any interest to you, reach out to me or anyone in a BV hoodie. I forgot mine today, like a bad BV spokesperson. But it's an opportunity to do a lot of cool stuff. But if not, just keep us in mind for anything involved with meetups and stuff. We want to definitely be a participant in the community and kind of spur the open web forward. We want to make sure open source is a kind of cornerstone of that work. And so anyway, hit me if you have any questions about any of this stuff, and we're really happy to be able to host you. And I think Paul ran away. Paul. Get 10 more pieces. Yeah. Yeah, apparently they're after 45 minutes, yeah, we can't deliver it to you. And it took them that long to find that out. Let's see what else Paul has on here.
If only there was something that could review them.
Exactly. If only we had a local service for reviews. Inside joke, it's not a good one. I mean, this list looks really great. He's really organized. Anyone know any jokes? No jokes. Please clap. Oh.
Cool, so I guess we're getting plates. We can get pizza during the next presentation or during this quick break. But cool. So tonight's main presenter is Clayton Anderson. He's the technical strategist and a partner at the BHW Group, which is an Austin-based web and mobile app consulting company. I've known Clayton for almost 10 years. We went to school together, and I've worked with him ever since. He's been lead developer on several web and React Web and React Native projects. He wrote our internal use React template, and he actually taught me React as well. So here's our main speaker, Clayton Anderson.
Hello. Give me a second here to get set up. I'm going to grab my slides. But I'm happy to be here. This is exciting. It's fun to meet a bunch of people at the last meetup and hoping to, help kind of spread the knowledge on this stuff. React's been hugely fun for us to use and learn, and thank you. It's been a big boon to our productivity, and it's something I'm always excited about sharing with people. All right. I'll turn off Flux. Okay, so as Paul said, I work at the BHW Group. We're an Austin, Texas web and mobile development company. And this is kind of about why we ended up using React and how it's been beneficial to us. So I know everyone's exact needs and history are all a little bit different, but I think the lessons we've learned along the way can be valuable and are instructive as to why React is been such a good fit for us and what others are doing. So I call this a pragmatic introduction to React. And you might be wondering right off the bat, what is React? And Facebook and Instagram, the creators of it, call it a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. So I want to get more into that in a second, but first, it's time for how we got here, or a brief history of web development. So this is going to be a little bit different for everyone, as I said, but for us in particular, all of our projects vary quite a bit in size. So we've built some really large apps, some really small apps, and everywhere in between. All of our developers end up working on multiple projects, so having transferable knowledge from project to project is very important to us. The technology we use is a major part of helping to satisfy those goals. So what I call the first era is when everything was server rendered, and for most of the history of the web, this was pretty much the only game in town. So for decades, people were using something like PHP or ASP to have view templates on the server, which when a request would come in, they would completely render the page and send a full HTML document back. So browsers had little to no JavaScript support, and there was not much of an expectation for dynamic client behavior. This is before the days of stuff like Gmail or Google Maps. I'm going to go through the pros and cons of each of these eras. And for server rendered, I think there's some nice benefits to it. You had limited capabilities, but it was easy to get started. Nowadays, if you want to be a web developer, or you want to build an entire web app yourself, you need to know a server language and the client language. So not having the burden of learning JavaScript on top of whatever you were doing on the server really saves a lot of time and mental effort. It's also easy to reason about and scale. You didn't have these vastly complicated pages that made it hard to continue to add on to an app over time. And in particular, if your server was stateless, which is best practice, there wasn't much trickiness to scaling it up. This is going to be varying importance to different people, but for a lot of systems is absolutely crucial. If you're trying to run a shop online or something like that, you need good search engine optimization so that computers can understand what the content of your pages is about. And the traditional server-rendered web was great at that. The cons of this era, there's really not like anything I would say is too awful or anything. You just had very limited capabilities. That said, one of the downsides here is that even the smallest interaction that you wanted your user to be able to have with a page would require a full round trip to the server and a complete render in its template. So even if you wanted to just swap out one tiny piece of HTML, there's all this extra overhead of the entire request. And as I said, just limited ability for dynamic pages. The next era is server rendered, but with incremental JavaScript. And this is kind of where people started to think about web apps versus just websites. We saw, browsers were starting to get better, JavaScript support was improving, and there were libraries like jQuery, which helped out with papering over the different scenes of browsers and providing a lot of utility functions. So there's a lot of super cool demos and stuff from this time. This is when things started getting impressive. Like you'd see animations or really slick form validation, like embedding Google Maps, things like that. So this is really when the web started to take off. So nice things here, there's still a pretty gentle learning curve. So your app was still mostly just the traditional server rendered approach, but you just kind of sprinkle on a little bit of JavaScript where you needed it. And there wasn't so much an expectation of like, I'm going to be a complete JavaScript master or anything. You'd kind of just find the jQuery plugins you need and add them wherever necessary. So yeah, easy to drop in jQuery as needed. You still had good SEO because your app was rendered on the server. And any kind of like client-side changes you had were after the user already had a full page. And there's a huge plugin ecosystem. jQuery was wildly popular, so for most things you might want to do, it was really easy to find somebody else who'd already done it and add that to your own system in a pretty short amount of time. The downsides here, though, is that it's very likely you're going to end up repeating view logic between the server and the client. And this is a really big one in my mind, because if you're building a complicated system, you're going to have pieces of the page that are only conditionally present based upon some data associated with the request or the user. Like if they're not an admin, you don't want to show them links to an admin system or something like that. But because now that you've got this dynamic client-side behavior as well, you might have some action the user takes that changes some of this data, and you don't want to do that full round trip. You just want to modify it in place with JavaScript. So you've ended up having the exact same logic in two separate places, in two separate languages, and two separate frameworks. So you can imagine that the burden of building your applications this way is gigantic. And to go along with it, with jQuery, is really easy to end up with what I call selector hell, wherein you wrote all your HTML, and then you're like, okay, now I'm going to add my JavaScript, and you write all these jQuery selectors, and hopefully you were just using class names. You might have used children's selectors or something like that, and then it gets really, really impossible to ever disentangle your JavaScript and HTML. And as such, it's very hard to reason about. Like these big pages would become incredibly complicated, and it's, as such, difficult to scale. And none of this to say that there's anything wrong with jQuery. I think this was just kind of the era of people wanting to do more and just barely having the capabilities to do it, but we weren't really making higher level abstractions yet. jQuery is a very low level utility library, which is great and super useful and still useful today, but for building an entire application, it's not necessarily the best choice, and hard to test. Oh yeah, so I had huge plugin ecosystem on the prior slide. I have it here again. The reason for that is, in the jQuery days, the module dependency stuff was mentioned a second ago. There was none of that here. Everything was just thrown on the global window scope, and you had no idea what any plugin was going to do to your page, your HTML, unless you went and read through its source code. So yeah, there were a lot of great plugins you could get, but you might also end up creating just this huge monster of a page as you added plugin after plugin. You had no idea what they were doing. So the next era is what I call the monolithic framework, and this is where paths are going to diverge a little bit. For us, this was Angular. For other people, it might be something like Backbone or Ember, all of which are still used today, so it's not like these are discrete periods of time. But Angular was awesome at the time for us. It really upped our productivity and let us focus on building larger, more complicated apps without the burden of jQuery. But unfortunately, it really introduced a huge list of its own problems along the way. So we'll start with the good stuff. No more element selectors. I think this is really huge. And I'm going to talk more later about the kind of interconnectedness of your presentation and logic. But the way jQuery worked of selecting pieces of HTML in your logic code, I think is just a really, really bad way to do this at scale. And Angular's removal of that was a great idea. It's kind of where we started to think more about a declarative view instead of imperatively modifying the view like we do in jQuery. So you're not asking, what manipulations do I make to my page to get it to look the way I want, but instead, what declarations do I make that just depend upon some data which represent what my page should look like? And if you were making a single page application, SPA, this was the first time we started seeing cleaner separation between the server and the client. So before, we still had these server rendered views and jQuery that operated off of them. Now you can just purely have a JSON API server on one end and your SPA on the other. And as such, much easier to scale. Angular had defined ways of making different pages and pulling in data dependencies. So it just gave you a lot more than jQuery did. But here's that long list of cons. First one, this has been talked about a lot. Angular has pretty bad performance, and I think worse than the bad performance is that when things go wrong, it's very, very hard to tune. Like if you end up with a giant Angular page, it can be pretty difficult to figure out exactly why it's slow and how to decouple things. Huge learning curve. Angular comes just packed full of its own custom terminology and methods for doing things, which makes it really, really tricky to get started other than just blindly copying stuff over from code samples. Hard to debug. Anyone who's worked with Angular has had an infuriating long night on Stack Overflow Googling the most cryptic error message they've ever seen. It is just full of this. Angular has so many pitfalls. So all the details of scope inheritance, et cetera, and this is an Angular presentation, but it can be not fun. I mentioned this, conflicting approaches for accomplishing the same task. So you just kind of end up with this, division of how different developers approach the same thing. And it wants to own your entire app. This is another big one, especially now with NPM. There's so many great libraries out there that you can really easily pull in, but the Angular approach is to not do that. It's like they want you to do everything the Angular way, and if you're ever trying to interface with other frameworks, it gets tricky. And once again, this won't matter to everyone, but if it does matter, it means that Angular is just not an option. Your entire page is all rendered on the client, so with Angular you get no search engine optimization. Google's done a little bit of work since they own Angular to make their crawler understand what Angular apps are doing, but it's still a pretty poor choice if you care about SEO. Okay, so that brings us to what we're here to talk about, the modern era of React. And I don't want to say like React is perfect or we're going to use it forever, but what's been so valuable to us is that I think React does a really great job of addressing all these pain points that I've mentioned, and at the same time, it's really fun to use and learn. So let's get into that. Easy to learn and reason about. This is going to be the main thing I talk about with React. It's got a very clear path forward for both learning it as a beginner, and once you're developing more and more complicated systems, there's a clear flow of both data and control in a way that makes it really easy to scale up. Easy to test. It's got good SEO. This does have the requirement that you do isomorphic or universal, so you pre-render your app on the server in addition to doing it on the client. The good news is that that's actually pretty easy to do. React was built with it in mind, and there's a lot of really great guides online about how to do this if you're interested. And we still have that clean separation from the Angular era between the API server and an SPA, so there's no regression there. And there's good performance, and more importantly, if you ever have bad performance with React app, it offers a clear path to tuning it. That's one of their kind of fundamental design goals, is that if you are having poor performance, you'll be able to figure out exactly why and what to do about it. And it's got straightforward integration with a larger app or other libraries. A lot of people use React for just small pieces of a larger app when it makes sense, or if you want to use great libraries like Lodash or Moment, it's really easy to pull them in. The downsides, I'd be remiss to not mention a couple here. First is that server rendering still isn't as fast as the traditional server approaches. If you're server rendering React compared to something like an ASP.NET Razor template, you're just not going to be quite as good there. And I've talked about how React works great with other stuff and everything, but some people just honestly prefer the more all-encompassing style of framework. They want to know exactly how to make a route or pull in data services and things like that. React is a little bit hands-off with that, and they want you to build your own path. Lastly, and given the spirit of this section being about the historical perspective on this, I don't know. Like, it's interesting to think about a few years from now, what are people going to point to the current era and say, these were the downsides. So I think React is awesome, but it is always worth pointing out that things are always going to improve and change, and we're going to have a better perspective on this stuff down the road. So you might be asking at this point, what is React? Well, I think, my kind of thesis statement on it is that React is a view library that's whole goal is to abstract away DOM manipulations. So you shouldn't, with React, ever have to worry about manually manipulating HTML, removing it, or adding it. Instead, you just declaratively say, based on some input data, this is what my output should look like. And React is going to handle all of the messy details of manipulating the DOM for you and is optimized to do it in a performant way. So my little code exercise here is going to be just make a simple friends list widget. We're not going to worry about styles, anything like that, just kind of the core of what makes React useful and build up here. So I have a sample data structure here, very simple. It's just an array of JavaScript objects representing some friends in an online system. So you've got an ID, their name, and a Boolean representing whether or not they're online. So the first step here is to just render our friends list with React, but really have no logic to it, just the simplest possible React example, which looks like this. And I'll just want to go through and explain the things here that might appear foreign. Sorry if this is zoomed out a little bit. But I have the friends array right here. I just put an ellipsis so we don't waste space with the data we already saw. But React.component is the building block in a React app. You divide your UI up into components, which are the kind of encapsulation of logic and presentation you're going to make your app out of. So these could be things like, buttons, lists, forms, a header, an entire page. They're very composable. The idea is that they're a level of abstraction that lets you work with the details, but they build upon each other in a really nice way. So the one requirement of a React component is that it has a render function. This is the only thing you'll ever need, or the only thing that's an absolute requirement. And what render does is return this HTML-looking structure, which is what you want this component to look like when React renders it to screen. And you never have to call render yourself. React knows when something has changed and when it should check, do I need to change the HTML for this component? So what we're looking at here is a wrapping div, and inside of that, we just map across our array of friends, and for each one, return their last name and first name. So looking at this, there's a few nice things about it. So this HTML looking structure is called JSX. It's React's JavaScript extension, and this is just syntactic sugar for its own internal JavaScript functions representing various HTML elements. So it's a little bit magic. You're not used to seeing HTML in code, but the nice thing about it is there's a one-to-one mapping between this and just internal function calls. So there's not too much special going on, and you don't have to use it. But it does save time over writing the functions themselves as far as representing what you want your HTML to look like. Second, we're just using the built-in array map function here. So there's no magic to that part. If you're not familiar with map, it's a really valuable tool and is basically just, instead of writing a for loop and building up another array from a source array, map just lets you pass in a function that transforms each element in an array and returns some output off of that. So what we're saying here is for every friend, we just want to return some HTML that contains their information. Okay, so obviously this is super hard-coded right now. I just have the friends array declared in place. So the next step is going to be, how do we genericize our friends list a little bit? And the answer to that is props. And this is the second thing in the list of React terminology that you absolutely need to know. So instead of hard-coding the friends array before, now I have this.props.friends. The data structure is exactly the same. I haven't changed anything else. What a prop is essentially just a function or a parameter into your component. What's the one thing you need to know about props besides that is that they're immutable. So in the friends list component itself, I'm not allowed to change it. I can read it, but I can't edit it. After this, we could think about augmenting the behavior of our friends list a little bit. So we have that isOnline Boolean from before, but we haven't done anything with it yet. So why don't we extend the friends list such that we can filter it so we only show the friends that are online right now. Okay, so this introduces the third main React concept, which is state. State and props are the two ways that you get to data in a React component. The difference is that state is managed within the component you're looking at and is mutable, whereas props, as I said, are immutable and passed in from the parent. So our friends list now is tracking this Boolean, show online only, which just represents the toggle of whether or not we want to show all of our friends or just those that are online. And this state declaration at the top here just represents the initial value for it. And toggle filter is just a custom function we put in our component. There's nothing React specific about it. And set state is used to modify the state. The only reason that's even necessary is just so React can internally know you need to re-render. If you modify it in place, it won't have any idea that something's changed. So now we have this checkbox representing the control over that Boolean. So when we check this box or uncheck it, it'll alter our Boolean, and that's actually all this does. We're not modifying the array yet, but we'll do that in a second. Okay, so the only change here now is based on show online only, we're going to either use the entire list or filter it to just those are online. And just like map, filter is a built-in array function. It's a really useful tool, but there's no magic to it. Okay, so I've kind of been talking about some of the reasons why I think React is easy to learn, but there's some nice points to notice here. As I said, we're using the native array, map, and filter functions. And I know I'm making a big deal about this, but a lot of libraries don't do this. They come with their own custom implementations for a lot of JavaScript fundamentals, whereas React is all about embracing the platform that it runs on. So the skill set that you get while learning React is transferable to other code bases and vice versa. I've worked with a lot of React code bases now, and the truth is most components consist of only render props and state. There's some additional React features that we could talk about that I'm going to leave out for today, but that's honestly because with just what we've talked about so far, you are able to get going and do most things that you'd want to do. Another good thing to think about, data structures are just plain objects and arrays. So all the utilities you're used to for managing those are the exact same. So a lot of libraries come with custom model classes so that they can do data tracking and everything through there. But with React, if you want to use array slice or object merges or anything like that, it's the exact same you're used to. Okay, so let's think about extending the friends list component a little bit more. Right now it's not doing very much. We're just showing the names and toggling that Boolean. So let's consider the example where we have a lot more information on an individual friend, maybe like a profile picture, a friend count, additional information about them. At some point, our component would start to get cumbersome as we add more and more to it. We don't want it to get too large. So React is highly composable, and the idea here is as soon as we feel like it's necessary, we can pull an individual friend out to be its own component. And for simplicity's sake, I'm not going to worry about adding all those examples we talked about, but this is what another component looks like. This is an individual friend. And you'll notice we've got different props this time. So we have this data prop representing the data for an individual friend. So now in friends list, instead of doing that in line, in our map, we've changed it so we use the friend component and just pass the individual friend in as the data prop. And this is really how you start building any React component. You identify what the bite-sized pieces are, your building blocks, the components, and you just take a divide and conquer approach there, start building them and composing your entire application out of them. So, looking at this list, if we ended up having a lot more controls over it, like maybe we wanted to search the friends list in addition to filter it, maybe we want to be able to sort the friends list, those are all things that could be broken out into their own component as soon as they become large enough to merit having their own place and logic that way. And then this would fit into a larger page in a sidebar, which is part of a page, and so on and so forth. So I don't want to like just dunk on Angular here, but for comparison's sake, I think it's worth looking at the way that you would do this in Angular, right? So this is what an Angular template for this would look like, and there's immediately a lot of questions, right? What are all these ng attributes? What does this filter mean? What is its syntax? And here's the Angular controller. What is $scope? Where does it come from? Et cetera. And you know I introduced this like fully formed compared to building it up, so it's not the fairest comparison. But after spending a couple years with Angular, I'll tell you that the answer to these questions are the kind of thing you might find in a Lovecraftian book. Like you don't actually want to know because they get worse and worse the more you read about it. And there's a big question here of like, how would I extend or alter this? You know, if I was a junior JavaScript developer and I came to this, like, there's not a lot of fundamentals on display here. Like almost everything in these code samples is Angular specific. Like I really feel like learning something like Angular only teaches you Angular, you don't learn JavaScript. But the goal of React is to both let you use any existing JavaScript knowledge you have and immediately profit from that. But if you don't know JavaScript, React is a great way to both learn the language while you're learning the framework. Okay, so this is, you know, not the most scientific of study, but I think these are some statistics that are worth considering. From GitHub stars and watchers, Angular and React definitely seem to be in the same ballpark with regards to popularity and usage. I pulled all these numbers yesterday, but if you look at Stack Overflow, Angular has over 10 times as many questions as React does. So don't just take it from me, like everyone is having a much easier time learning React than they are, you know, some of the other popular frameworks out there. Okay, so the other main thing to think about with React as you scale is that it's easy to reason about, and there's a lot of great reasons for this, and I think, you know, Facebook put a lot of thought into how they built it. And this is the single most important takeaway. With React, the output of your render function is a pure function of props and state. By pure, I mean that given the same inputs, it will always have the same output, and it doesn't have any side effects. Back in the jQuery days, it was really easy to write some combination of selectors that would do something else, like it might make a network request or modify some unrelated piece of the page, because when you were just trying to get something done for like that night's deploy or whatever, that's what you needed that one time, and you come back to it later and things have changed, and it just kind of piled upon itself that way. React forces you to think about your application in a much cleaner way, which is, you know, an exact input data and the output presentation. Some additional points here. React has this co-location of concerns, and this was kind of a subject of controversy when React was first announced. Like, people saw JSX, and we'd been trained for years, like, don't put your HTML and JavaScript next to each other. But after having used it for several years now, I think it's actually proven to be one of the best things about React. Previously, you would find yourself flipping back and forth between files constantly. And when you think about it, presentation and logic are always going to be interconnected. I don't think there's any way that you can truly 100% separate the two, because as the logic of your app happens, as users' data changes, the presentation is going to change. They're always tied. But what we ended up doing before was treating the entire presentation and the entire logic as if they were separate building blocks, rather than the individual pieces of them that are encapsulated together as the building block that we want to make an application out of. React does a really good job of this, because now you've got, you know, something like your friends list that you can drop in wherever you need it, and you know it's going to work because the view and logic are encapsulated together, and you have a clear understanding of exactly what the inputs of a friend list is. Your entire view layer is a tree of components. This is another important one. With React, you're always going to have a single root node. So your top level component is just going to be called like app or something like that. And from there, it's going to, you know, descend into this tree of other components. And what this lets you do is think very differently about your app. In the old days, you weren't entirely sure what was happening as the user clicked around, because they would take a different path every time. And as you were making these manipulative changes, it was really easy to end up in a state where you thought some piece of HTML was going to be one way, but it was actually another way because the user took a path you didn't think about and your app exploded. So combining the fact that your view layer is a tree with the fact that renders are always synchronous in React, meaning you can't do any asynchronous operations in them, like make a network request or anything like that. It means you can make an entire render of your app in one synchronous go. You can start at the top and work your way through the entire app and render it at once. So it becomes very easy to reason about the data and control flow. So you know your root component is going to render, and then it's going to render its children, and they're going to render all their children. And the data flows from the top down the entire way. So you can follow stack traces easily, and you know exactly what's going on. And this is a huge benefit to performance as well. This is part of what I was mentioning earlier about how React makes it easy to tune your performance. If there's particular branches of your view layer that are slow, it becomes very easy to just prune the entire branch in a render path. Like if you're rendering some really complicated system and you know, like, I don't actually need to render this every time, like the user doesn't necessarily need to see the most up-to-date information constantly, it becomes really easy to say like, oh, well, only re-render this every 5th time the data changes, or whatever the case may be for your application. So I think there's never been a better time to start using React. It's been proven in production. Obviously, huge organizations like Facebook and Instagram are using it, Netflix, Walmart, like a lot of really big companies. And there's a bunch of really great educational resources. I put a couple up here. We're going to put these slides up online later if you want to follow these links, but you can also just Google these names and find them. React's been a huge success for us. Like for the first time, I feel like I don't even have to think about the view layer that much, which is really freeing. It lets you focus on the more important parts of your application, and you just don't have to worry so much of like what possible state is the user in that causes this HTML output. You know, based upon some input data, what it is. And I think that's only going to get better, actually. There's a lot of work being done right now in static analysis and type systems for JavaScript. With a model like React, it becomes very easy to say, given the input state of my app, if there's ever holes in what my output could be, for example, I have some Boolean and I didn't satisfy the false condition, I only rendered as if it were true, that's a potential bug that could happen, and that's the kind of thing that static analysis is gonna find. So I think this stuff's only gonna get better. People are building really awesome tools with React. So that's it, thank you. So I can answer any questions if you guys have them. I imagine people are pretty hungry too. So I'll be around as well after this, but yeah, go ahead.
I think you've been using it at your company.
Mm-hmm.
What's been the upgrading process been like?
Yeah, so he asked what upgrading React was like. It's actually been pretty good overall. I don't know if you saw this, but Facebook announced their plan to go past 1.0 just recently. So they've been pre 1.0 for a while, which means they didn't have to follow semantic versioning exactly. But fortunately for us, they've been really diligent about documenting what exactly their breaking changes are going to be between versions. And they always announce what those breaking changes are going to be, like a full version in advance, so you can kind of prepare for it a little bit. They're releasing code mods as well for it, which is an automated tool to go in and modify your code for you when breaking changes happen. So honestly, upgrading Babel has been like way more work than upgrading React ever was. Like, I don't think I've ever spent more than 30 minutes on a project to go in and upgrade React. It's usually pretty fast. Yeah.
You mentioned any other
Sure, yeah, so we've used Webpack on most of our projects. I've used Browserify on a couple. I don't want to speak to Rollup having not used it, but I know people are pretty happy with it who have, so I don't think there's anything about React in particular that would cause problems with any particular bundler, but there is a lot of like literature on the combination of Webpack and React, which is part of why we used it, and in kind of my own experience, Webpack has been nice to work with. So I know that's not like really a great answer, but I can't think of any problems there would be from using it with Rollup. Yeah.
For a really junior account developer, one problem I had with React, I just started last week to code a little bit.
Yeah.
And I find out it's because it's only part of the view, it's not a full using all of my framework. So one of the problems is like what other components I have to put in for a full application, right? If my end goal is to build a pretty complex one, and if I choose the wrong one or something which is outdated, how do I handle this as a kind of
Yeah, so he asked about React only being a view layer, how to know what other pieces to pull in and how to keep them updated, that sort of thing. And You know, that's honestly one of the things that people are having a lot of discussion about in the React community right now, because it doesn't have these like blessed approaches to doing certain things. You're kind of expected to pull in other libraries as you see fit. So it's been valuable for us, wherein like the old days, we oftentimes have to kind of color outside the lines occasionally of like, if you try to do something Angular didn't anticipate, it becomes really difficult because they expect you to do everything a certain way, whereas React, you build up from the ground a little bit. So we are kind of building upon some knowledge of some of those libraries, to be honest. So I can understand it being a little bit harder to get started with. Once again, fortunately though, I think this is something the community is becoming better and better about, of like documenting what the good choices are for things like that. So to build a large app, a lot of the things you might need, like a network request library, data manipulation, a router for React, those are the kinds of things that people are putting together a lot of resources on learning, what decisions to make, templates you can pull from, that sort of thing. But ultimately, I think that's a good point though, in that it can be a little bit hard to get started if you're trying to build something very complicated from the beginning. Yeah.
I found that the React Redux starter kit was a really good place.
Yeah, definitely. We use Redux on our projects. I think it's fantastic. I just don't want to like overload with too much stuff right now, but that's the kind of thing we might do a future presentation on for sure.
Breaking pages into components can be pretty tricky, and sometimes it takes a good developer to know just exactly how to break them down. Do you ever find that in large teams of developers that they will have duplicated components or components that are not exactly broken down correctly?
Yeah, I've definitely seen multiple developers will end up creating slightly different versions of the same component, which is not ideal. Like ideally, you would extend an existing component to add a few additional props, whatever you might need to let it handle both those scenarios. So I think it's a good point. Developers, if they're not communicating about what all their components do or structuring them in such a way as to avoid that scenario, it can happen. But I think that's the kind of thing you might end up with really with anything, right? And it's going to kind of come down to the team to communicate clearly what they're doing. So I think there's best practices you can follow for that. Like one of the things we've started doing, building entire applications out of React instead of just like individual little components on the page, is having a structure that's conducive to this. So certain components are going to exist as templates inside your router. So we put all those in a directory together. Certain components are going to be an entire page, and those go in a directory, and others are going to be like, the more bite-sized pieces, the kind of stuff like the friends list or a button that I talked about. So I think it'd be valuable to come up with a structure for how you organize that stuff to try to, prevent the scenario you're talking about. Yeah.
What do you use for Unit?
We use Mocha. I've found it to be fast, runs well. The one downside to it is that it doesn't mock stuff by default, which is pretty irritating just because you might not want to require all this stuff in. Jest from Facebook does that, but it's always been really slow every time I've tried it. I know they're working on it, so I hope that gets better, but we're using Mocha right now. Yeah.
So when you're deciding for an application, it's really easy in React to kind of include or exclude stuff, which means for a single page app, or you could go down the path of using the router and kind of doing.
Yeah, I think it's really just up to the app, and there's a question of scale there. Like, I think it's fine to just use plain React for smaller applications and just use a switch to switch between pages, essentially. Whereas the larger you get, the more benefit that React router has for you. It's got cool features, but a small app really doesn't need it. So some of the larger stuff we've built, we've used the router's ability to emit different JavaScript client files based on the route. So rather than having to download one really large file when you first hit a large multi-page app, it only downloads the React components that you need to render the page that you're on, and then we'll just download successive files as you click around. But for a small system, that's really not something you need at all. So I would recommend simplicity in the case of a small app and add something like a more complicated router when you need it. Cool. Well, if there's any other questions, feel free to find me after this. I'll be hanging around. But I think that's it for now. Thank you.